Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Book Time with Elvis with me, Mark. I hope you're all doing well and enjoying your Friday. I've just been chatting away with Sean D. Standfast, and we were talking about essays and talking about George Orwell and discussing, various essays that he had written. And one of the essays that he wrote is called Good Bad Books. And, it got me thinking, what are good bad books? And I think we might be entering into realms of, certainly in the modern sense, of criminology's Garborgus, perhaps, of maybe being good bad books. Books that are perhaps stylistically bad or poorly written, but they're good because people like them. I'm sure we all have some favourite books that would be, stylistically or technically classified as bad books, but for us they're oh so good. And so what I thought I would do is read to you Orwell's own interpretation of what good bad books are, and it may at times be controversial, and I will interject with my own thoughts because I've not read it before either. You may have done, actually. Sorry, I shouldn't assume that you haven't, but I haven't read it before, so this will be the first time. So if anything jumps out at me, I will stop and talk about it, because when I did the books versus cigarettes, it did raise a few questions as well, because how much of what he says in 1946 when he wrote that essay is relevant today in 2022. So let's explore this essay together, shall we? Good Bad Books. Not long ago, a publisher commissioned me to write an introduction for a reprint of a novel by Leonard Merrick. This publishing house, it appears, is going to reissue a long series of minor and partly forgotten novels of the 20th century. Now, for me, actually, that's quite interesting because, he's writing this pre-1950, so the century is, just coming up to halfway, I suppose. And it's interesting that he's already discussing books that have been forgotten in that time. Sean and myself, we will actually cover a few of the authors he mentions because I can see it in front of me. As I say, I haven't read it, but it's on the screen in front of me who they are in our series on misplaced authors. So it's interesting that it appears some of them were misplaced even back then. So we'll see. It is a valuable service in these bookless days, and I rather envy the person whose job it will be to scout round the threepenny boxes hunting down copies of his boyhood favourites. That would be rather awesome, wouldn't it? And it's interesting that he's linked that to childhood. That perhaps these... I suppose, perhaps in his time, I don't know much about the history of, writing for children. Obviously you have the fairy tales by the likes of Christian Andersen and Brothers Grimm and others. But I suppose the 19th century would have been the real kind of boom time for, books that are being published en masse for the entertainment of children, and certainly into the early 20th century. So by the time those people would have, be the age that Orwell is when he's writing this, I suppose you could see how they could be forgotten. A type of book which we hardly seem to produce in these days, but which flowered with great richness in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, is what Chesterton called the good bad book. That is, the kind of book that has no literary pretensions, but which remains readable when more serious productions have perished. Obviously, outstanding books in this line are Raffles and the Sherlock Holmes stories, which have kept their place when innumerable problem novels, human documents, and terrible indictments of this or that have fallen into deserved oblivion. Who has worn better, Conan Doyle or Meredith? Almost in the same class as these, I put R. Austin Freeman's earlier stories, The Singing Bone, The Eye of Osiris, and others. Ernest Bramah's Max Carados, and, dropping the standard a bit, Guy Boothby's Tibetan thriller Dr. Nicola, a sort of schoolboy version of Hugh's Travels in Tartary, which would probably make a real visit to Central Asia seem a dismal anticlimax. Yeah, I do wonder. I mean, with these kind of boys' own adventure books, when people actually go to those places, I could well imagine it could seem an anticlimax, for sure, even back in those days. But apart from thrillers, there were minor humorous writers of the period. For example, Pett Ridge, but I admit his full-length books no longer seem readable. E. Nesbit, The Treasure Seekers. George Birmingham, who was good so long as he kept off politics. The pornographic Binstead, Picture of the Pinken. Now, I don't know about you. You want to go away now and Google Binstead, don't you? And especially this book, Pinken. Sounds a bit... Well, it sounds pornographic, doesn't it? So yeah, let me know in the comments if you've if you found it on Project Gutenberg. And if American books can be included, Booth Tarkington's Penrod stories. A cut above most of these was Barry Payne. Some of Payne's humorous writings are, I suppose, still in print, but to anyone who comes across it, I recommend what must now be a very rare book, The Octave of Claudius, a brilliant exercise in the macabre. So, yeah, I kind of want to look that up as well now. Somewhat later in time, there was Peter Blundell, who wrote in the W. Jacobs vein about Far Eastern seaport towns, and who seems to be rather unaccountably forgotten in spite of having been praised in print by H.G. Wells. However, all the books I have been speaking of are frankly escape literature. Yeah, I would say that's fair. They are kind of like comfort. You have comfort eating, comfort food. Why not comfort books? Escapist books, as he's saying. And certainly, I suppose, nobody necessarily puts, apart from me, puts Jerome Freeman in a boat at the top of the greatest novels ever written, because, there are many other novels that are better written, but almost no other novel gives me the joy that does, and I think, that's part of it. Though I wouldn't say it was a bad book. That's a good bad book. I wouldn't say that about it, but certainly I can see, how that might work. What he's saying there about escapist literature. They form pleasant patches in one's memory, quiet corners where the mind can browse at odd moments, but they hardly pretend to have anything to do with real life. There is another kind of good bad book which is more seriously intended, and which tells us, I think, something about the nature of the novel and the reasons for its present decadence. It's interesting. I like that. The decadence of the novel, in the 1940s. So, interesting. During the last 50 years, there has been a whole series of writers, some of them are still writing, whom it is quite impossible to call good by any strictly literary standard, but who are natural novelists and who seem to attain sincerity partly because they are not inhibited by good taste. In this class, I put Leonard Merrick himself, W. L. George, J. D. Beresford, Ernest Raymond, May Sinclair, and, at a lower level than the others, but still essentially similar, A.S.M. Hutchinson. Do you know any of those people? I don't. Most of these have been prolific writers, and their output has naturally varied in quality. I am thinking in each case of one or two outstanding books, for example Merrick's Cynthia, J.D. Beresford's A Candidate for Truth, W. L. George's Caliban, May Sinclair's The Combined Maze, and Ernest Raymond's We the Accused. In each of these books, the author has been able to identify himself with his imagined characters, to feel with them and invite sympathy on their behalf with a kind of abandonment that cleverer people would find it difficult to achieve. They bring out the fact that intellectual refinement can be a disadvantage to a storyteller, as it would be to a music hall comedian. Take, for example, Ernest Raymond's We the Accused, a peculiarly sordid and convincing murder story, probably based on the Crippen case. That's Dr. Crippen, 10 Rillington Place, was it? Famous murderer in... What am I talking about? Nonsense. That's Christie. Crippen was the one who tried to escape to America and he got caught. I always confused Christie and Crippen. Silly me. Yeah, I was thinking because Christie was post Second World War, so that wouldn't work. Oh dear, oh dear. So, I think it gains a great deal from the fact that the author only partly grasps the pathetic vulgarity of the people he is writing about and therefore does not despise them. Perhaps it even, like Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy, gains something from the clumsy, long-winded manner in which it is written. Detail is piled on detail with almost no attempt at selection, and in the process an effect of terrible, grinding cruelty is slowly built up. So also with A Candidate for Truth. Here, there is not the same clumsiness, but there is the same ability to take seriously the problems of commonplace people. So also with Cynthia, and at any rate the earlier part of Caliban, the greater part of what W. L. George wrote was shoddy rubbish. But in this particular book, based on the career of Northcliffe, he achieved some memorable and truthful pictures in lower middle-class London life. Parts of this book are probably autobiographical, and one of the advantages of good bad writers is their lack of shame in writing autobiography. Exhibitionism and self-pity are the bane of the novelist, and yet if he is too frightened of them, his creative gift may suffer. The existence of good bad literature, the fact that one can be amused or excited or even moved by a book that one's intellect simply refuses to take seriously, is a reminder that art is not the same thing as cerebration. I imagine that by any test that could be devised, Carlyle would be found to be a more intelligent man than Trollope, yet Trollope has remained readable and Carlyle has not. Well, that's particularly apt, seeing as Steve Donahue and myself are reading Trollope at the moment, aloud to you. If you haven't checked it out, there's a playlist. We're reading The Warden. Little plug there, The Warden by Anthony Trollope. And it's great fun, and I can see his point there, perhaps. Carlyle's very interesting, but Trollope's good fun, and sometimes that's what you need, isn't it, in a book? Fun. Yet Trollope has remained readable, and Carlyle has not. With all his cleverness, he had not even the wit to write in plain, straightforward English. In novelists, almost as much as in poets, the connection between intelligence and creative power is hard to establish. A good novelist may be a prodigy of self-discipline like Flaubert, or he may be an intellectual sprawl like Dickens. Enough talent to set up dozens of ordinary writers has been poured into Wyndham Lewis's so-called novels, such as Tar or Snooty Baronet. Yet it would be a very heavy labour to read one of these books right through. Some indefinable quality, a sort of literary vitamin, which exists even in a book like If Winter Comes, is absent from them. Perhaps the supreme example of the good-bad book is Uncle Tom's Cabin. Remember, this is all George Orwell here. It is an unintentionally ludicrous book, full of preposterous melodramatic incidents. It is also deeply moving and essentially true. It is hard to say which quality outweighs the other, but Uncle Tom's Cabin, after all, is trying to be serious and to deal with the real world. How about the frankly escapist writers, the purveyors of thrills and light humour? How about Sherlock Holmes? Vice versa. Dracula, Helen's Babies, or King Solomon's Mines? Love King Solomon's Mines. All of these are definitely absurd books. Books which one is more inclined to laugh at than with, and which were hardly taken seriously even by their authors. Very true, very true. I think Haggard didn't take King Solomon's Mines particularly seriously. Yet they have survived and will probably continue to do so. Well, Mr. Orwell, I can tell you, in the case of, Uncle Tom's Cabin and Sherlock Holmes, Dracula, and King Solomon's Mines, they're still surviving. We're still reading them, still talking about them here in September 2022. Helen's Babies, on the other hand, I've never heard of. Have you? All one can say is that while civilization remains such that one needs distraction from time to time, light literature has its appointed place, also that there is such a thing as sheer skill or native grace, which may have more survival value than erudition or intellectual power. There are music hall songs which are better poems than 3/4 of the stuff that gets into anthologies. Come where the booze is cheaper, Come where the pots hold more. Come where the boss is a bit of a sport. Come to the pub next door. Or again, two lovely black eyes. Oh, what a surprise. Only for calling another man wrong. Two lovely black eyes. I would far rather have written either of those than say The Blessed Damozel or Love in the Valley, and by the same token, I would back Uncle Tom's Cabin to outlive the complete works of Virginia Woolf or George Moore, though I know of no strictly literary test which would show where the superiority lies. Well, that's interesting because, I don't know much about George Moore, but I know Virginia Woolf has still survived, and I would wager she's probably more read, more widely read than Uncle Tom's Cabin, perhaps, at least internationally. Perhaps in the United States it would be a different thing. Anyway, so there we go. Good Bad Books by George Orwell. Read and commented on a little bit by me, Mark. Everybody, thank you so much for watching. I do really appreciate it. And I look forward ever so much to seeing you all again very soon. Do take care. Bye-bye.